The door to the study slammed shut before Elias Ashworth had even finished crossing the threshold, and his father was already on his feet, his face red with fury. "You will marry Lady Vane before the month is out," the old Duke said, "or you will leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back." Elias stood still, his jaw tight, his hands clenched behind him so his father would not see them shake. He had known this day was coming for years, ever since his mother had been sent away in disgrace, and had died alone in a small house near the coast, forgotten by everyone except her son. He had watched his father erase her from every portrait, every letter, every mention at the dinner table, as though she had never existed at all, and now the same man stood before him, demanding that Elias hand over his own life to seal a political alliance with a family the old Duke admired for their money and their silence. "I will not marry a woman I have never spoken to," Elias said, "because you wish to control who sits beside me at breakfast for the rest of my days." "You have no choice," his father said. "You are the Duke of Culross only because I allow it. The title can be stripped from you in ways you do not understand. Marry Lady Vane, or lose everything your name has ever meant." Elias felt something break loose inside him, some final thread of patience that had held for 28 years. He looked at his father, a man who had never once asked how he was feeling, who had punished his own wife for loving too openly and too honestly, and he made a decision in that instant that he would spend the rest of the day regretting and defending in equal measure. "Then I will marry someone of my own choosing," he said, "and you will have no say in it at all." His father laughed, a short, ugly sound. "And who, exactly, do you imagine would have you, with a father like me watching every move you make?" Elias did not answer. He turned and walked out of the study, out of the house, and into the cold afternoon air, his mind spinning with anger and no plan at all. He rode without direction for nearly an hour, his horse's hooves striking the frozen road, until he found himself at the edge of the village fair he had visited only once before, weeks earlier, on a whim. It was there, among the stalls selling ribbons and baked bread, that he saw her again. Margaret Winslow stood near a table of preserves, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, laughing at something an old woman had said. She had no idea who he was, or rather, she knew he was a duke, but she had never once treated him as though the title mattered more than the man standing in front of her. That single afternoon, weeks ago, she had spoken to him plainly, without flattery, without fear, and he had thought of her more than he cared to admit since. He dismounted and walked toward her, and something in his face must have shown the storm still raging inside him, because she set down the jar she was holding and studied him carefully. "You look as though you have just left a battlefield," she said. "I have, in a manner of speaking," he replied. She waited, saying nothing, simply watching him with the same steady patience he remembered from before. And in that moment, standing in the mud and noise of a village fair, Elias Ashworth made the second impulsive decision of his day, one that would change both their lives entirely. "Miss Winslow," he said, "would you consider marrying me?" She blinked, certain she had misheard him. "I am sorry, what did you say?" "Marry me," he said again, more firmly this time, as though saying it twice would make it more sensible. "I know it is a strange request, and I know we have spoken only once before today, but I need a wife, and I would rather choose one myself than have my father choose one for me." Margaret's first instinct was to laugh, to tell him he had clearly lost his senses, but something in his eyes stopped her. He was not teasing her, he was in fact entirely serious, and entirely desperate, though he tried to hide it behind the calm mask a duke was trained to wear. "You do not know me," she said carefully. "I know enough," he said. "I know you speak your mind. I know you are not impressed by titles, and right now that is exactly what I need." Margaret thought of her father, the Reverend, whose health had grown worse through the winter, whose small parish could no longer support the debts that had piled up from his illness. She thought of her younger brother Henry, who deserved an education their family could no longer afford, and she thought, with a strange and sudden clarity, that a marriage to a duke, however hollow at its start, might be the only thing standing between her family and ruin. "If I agree," she said, "it would not be for love. I want you to understand that clearly before you ask again." "I understand," Elias said. "I am not asking for love. I am asking for a wife who will not bend to my father's will. That is all." "Then I accept," she said, though her voice trembled slightly as she spoke the words, and neither of them smiled, because both understood exactly what kind of arrangement they had just made. The wedding took place 6 days later, in a small stone church with only a handful of witnesses. Margaret wore a plain gray dress, the finest one she owned, and Elias wore his usual dark coat, giving no sign that the day was meant to be anything but ordinary business. Her father stood beside her, pale and thin, praying silently that he had not sold his daughter into a life of misery. Henry stood at the back, arms crossed, glaring at the Duke as though daring him to hurt his sister. Halfway through the ceremony, the doors at the back of the church opened with a crash, and the old Duke walked in, his cane striking the stone floor with every step. The priest faltered. Margaret felt her stomach drop. "You would truly do this," the old man said, staring at his son. "You would marry a nobody to spite me." "I would," Elias said, without turning around. The old Duke's eyes moved to Margaret, sweeping over her plain dress with open contempt. "And you, girl, do you know what you are marrying into? Do you know what this family does to women who do not know their place?" Margaret lifted her chin, refusing to let her voice shake. "I know what I am marrying into, Your Grace. I imagine I shall learn the rest soon enough." The old Duke's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a sneer. "This marriage will not survive the season. Mark my words. By spring you will both regret this foolishness, and I will be standing here to remind you that I warned you." He turned and left as abruptly as he had arrived, the church doors banging shut behind him, and for a long moment nobody spoke. Then the priest, his hands still trembling, cleared his throat and continued the ceremony as though nothing at all had happened, though everyone in the room understood that something had shifted, that a war had quietly begun the moment Margaret Winslow became the Duchess of Culross. That evening, as their carriage rolled toward Culross Hall, Margaret watched the countryside pass by in silence, her new husband seated across from her, his face turned toward the window, unreadable. She wondered what kind of household she was about to enter, what kind of man she had truly agreed to spend her life with, and whether the old Duke's threat had been nothing more than an angry man's bluster, or a promise that neither of them would be able to escape. Elias, for his part, said nothing the entire journey, his mind still caught on his father's words, and beneath the anger, a small and unfamiliar worry began to take shape, one he could not yet name, about the woman sitting across from him, and about what he had just done to both of their lives. When the carriage finally turned through the iron gates of Culross Hall, Margaret leaned forward to see the house rising against the darkening sky, its stone walls tall and gray, its windows lit with only a handful of candles despite the size of the building. It looked less like a home, and more like a fortress that had forgotten how to welcome anyone inside it. "This is where you grew up," she said quietly. "It is where I existed," Elias replied. "There is a difference." She glanced at him, surprised by the honesty of the answer, but he offered nothing more, and the carriage rolled to a stop before she could ask what he meant. A line of servants waited on the front steps, their faces carefully blank, though Margaret could feel their eyes studying her as she stepped down from the carriage, taking in her plain dress, her unpolished shoes, her lack of jewels. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the butler said to Elias, then turned to Margaret with a stiff, formal bow that gave nothing away. "Your Grace," he added, though the title sat strangely on his tongue, as though he had not yet decided whether she deserved it. Margaret managed a small nod, determined not to let her nervousness show. She had faced worse than a roomful of skeptical servants, she told herself. She had nursed her father through fevers that nearly took his life, had stretched a single loaf of bread across a week when the harvest failed, had buried her mother without enough money for a proper stone. A cold house and a colder staff would not be the thing that broke her. Inside, the hall stretched high above her, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, though she noticed, as her eyes moved along the wall, that one space near the end was conspicuously bare, the wallpaper slightly darker, where a frame had once hung and been removed. She did not need to ask whose portrait had been taken down. She had heard enough in the village to guess. A housekeeper, a narrow woman with sharp eyes named Mrs. Dunmore, led her up a wide staircase to a set of rooms that smelled faintly of dust, as though they had not been properly opened in months. "These were prepared this morning, Your Grace," Mrs. Dunmore said, though her tone suggested she found the haste distasteful. "We were given very little notice." "I understand," Margaret said. "Thank you for your effort all the same." The housekeeper's expression flickered, some small surprise at being thanked, before she composed herself again and left without another word. Margaret stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the sound of the house settling around her, the creak of old wood, the distant echo of servants' footsteps, and somewhere far below, the low murmur of her husband's voice, speaking to someone she could not see. She sat on the edge of the large, unfamiliar bed and allowed herself, for the first time since the fair, a single moment of doubt. She had married a stranger to save her family, and in doing so, had walked directly into a house that did not want her and a war she barely understood. The old Duke's threat echoed in her mind, low and certain. By spring, you will both regret this foolishness. Margaret pressed her hands flat against her knees and made herself a quiet promise instead. Whatever came next, she would not be the one who regretted it first. Down the corridor, in a study far grander than the one his father kept, Elias poured himself a drink he did not want and stared at the fire without seeing it. He had spent the entire ride home rehearsing what he would say to his new wife once they were alone. Some explanation, some apology, some acknowledgement of the strange and reckless thing he had done. But when the moment came, he had said nothing at all, and now he sat with the silence pressing in around him, wondering if he had simply traded one kind of loneliness for another, and wondering, too, why the thought of Margaret Winslow sitting somewhere above him in this cold house bothered him more than he was willing to admit. Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices somewhere below her window, and by the time she had dressed and made her way downstairs, she found the housekeeper arguing with a thin, sharp-faced man in the hallway outside the estate office. "The accounts are not ready for anyone to see," the man was saying, "certainly not for her. Her name is the Duchess of Culross," Mrs. Dunmore replied coldly, "and I imagine that gives her the right to see whatever she pleases in this house." The man turned as Margaret approached, and his expression shifted quickly into something smoother, more practiced. "Your Grace, forgive me. I am Mr. Colton, steward of the estate. I did not mean any disrespect. I only meant that the accounts are complicated, and perhaps not the best use of your time." Margaret studied him for a moment, noting the way his eyes would not quite meet hers, the slight tremor in his hands as he held a ledger against his chest as though guarding it from her. "I have kept my father's parish accounts since I was 14 years old, Mr. Colton," she said. "I think I can manage complicated." He hesitated, clearly searching for another excuse, but found none that would not sound absurd spoken aloud, and reluctantly handed her the ledger before excusing himself with a stiff bow. Margaret carried the book to a small table near the window and began to read, and within an hour she understood exactly why Mr. Colton had not wanted her to see it. The numbers did not add up. Payments to tenants that never seemed to reach the tenants themselves. Repairs marked as completed on cottages that, according to notes from the housekeeper, still leaked through their roofs every time it rained. Money moving in small, careful amounts to accounts she did not recognize, spread out just enough that no single entry looked suspicious on its own, but together painted a clear picture of a man who had been quietly stealing from the estate for years, likely with the old Duke's knowledge, or at the very least his convenient blindness. She found Elias in the stable yard that afternoon, examining a horse's leg with the same distant, careful attention he seemed to give everything, and she waited until he had finished before approaching him. "Your steward is stealing from you," she said, with no preamble at all. Elias straightened slowly, studying her face to see if she was serious. "That is a significant accusation." "It is a significant sum," she replied, and held out the ledger, pointing to the entries she had marked. "He has been paying tenants less than what is recorded, pocketing the difference, and marking repairs as finished when they were never touched at all. I would guess he has done this for at least 3 years, though I cannot be certain without older records." Elias took the ledger and read through the pages she had marked, his expression darkening with each line. He said nothing for a long while, and Margaret began to wonder if she had overstepped, if perhaps this was the kind of matter a wife was not meant to involve herself in. But when he finally looked up, there was no anger directed at her, only a tired, weary kind of fury aimed somewhere else entirely. "My father hired Colton," he said quietly. 10 years ago, after my mother left. I never questioned it because I never had reason to look closely. I was young, and grieving, and glad to have one less thing to manage." "I am sorry," Margaret said, and meant it. Elias closed the ledger and looked at her properly, perhaps for the first time since the wedding, not as an obligation or a convenient solution to his father's demands, but as a person who had, within a single day of arriving in his house, uncovered a problem he had missed for years. "Thank you," he said, "for noticing what I did not." "It was not difficult," she said. "I simply read what was written." That evening at dinner, the two of them sat at opposite ends of a table far too long for only 2 people, the silence between them broken only by the sound of cutlery against china. Margaret, unwilling to spend her entire marriage eating in silence, finally set down her fork and spoke. "I would like to understand the household," she said, "if you are willing to explain it. The servants look at me as though they are waiting for me to disappear." Elias considered the request for a moment before answering. "My father ran this house on fear," he said. "Servants who displeased him were dismissed without warning, sometimes without pay owed to them. They have learned not to trust anyone who arrives here with authority over them, Because authority in this house has never been kind. And your mother? Margaret asked carefully. What was she like? Elias's expression closed slightly, though he did not refuse to answer. She was kind, he said. Too kind, my father said, though I never understood what that meant until I was older. She spoke to servants as equals. She gave away food and money to tenants my father thought undeserving. He called it weakness. I called it the only warmth this house ever had. What happened to her? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew some part of the answer from the whispers she had heard in the village. My father accused her of an affair, Elias said. I do not believe it was true, though I was young enough that I cannot say for certain. He sent her away before I was old enough to ask the right questions, and by the time I was old enough to go looking for her myself, she had died in a small house near the coast, alone, without any of us beside her. Margaret set down her glass, her earlier hunger forgotten.
I am sorry,
she said again, and this time the words carried more weight than they had before. Elias looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then he stood, thanking her for the conversation, in a voice that had gone carefully formal again, and excused himself for the evening, leaving Margaret alone at the long table with her half-finished meal, and a growing sense that the man she had married carried far more grief than his cold manner ever let on. Over the following days, Margaret threw herself into the running of the household, partly because it needed doing, and partly because it gave her something to occupy the long, empty hours in a house where she knew almost no one. She met with Mrs. Dunmore each morning to review the kitchen accounts, corrected a dozen small errors that had gone unnoticed for years, and slowly, carefully, began to win over a staff that had expected her to be either useless or cruel, and found instead a woman who worked harder than most of them. She confronted Mr. Colton directly, presenting him with the evidence she had gathered, and giving him a choice: repay what could be reasonably traced or face dismissal, and the involvement of the local magistrate. He chose to repay a portion immediately, pale and shaking, and Margaret reported the entire matter to Elias, who dismissed the man from his position within the week and installed a young, honest clerk from the village in his place, a decision that earned Margaret quiet nods of approval from servants who had watched Colton steal from them for years without any way to prove it. Word of the change spread quickly through the estate, and Margaret began to notice small shifts in how she was treated. A maid who smiled at her in the hallway, a groundskeeper who touched his cap respectfully as she passed, Mrs. Dunmore herself softening by degrees into something almost like warmth. She had not expected to find any comfort in Culross Hall, but slowly, without quite meaning to, she was building a place for herself within its cold stone walls. Elias noticed the change as well, though he said little about it directly. He began seeking her out in small ways, asking her opinion on estate matters he would once have decided alone, walking with her through the gardens in the evenings when the weather allowed it, though their conversations remained careful, guarded, neither of them quite willing to admit that the arrangement they had entered for entirely practical reasons was beginning to feel, in small and unexpected moments, like something else entirely. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Margaret asked Elias to accompany her to the tenant cottages at the edge of the estate, wanting to see for herself the conditions Colton had falsified in his ledgers. Elias agreed, more out of curiosity than obligation, and the two of them rode out together along a narrow lane lined with bare hedgerows, the winter air sharp against their faces. The first cottage they visited belonged to a widow named Agnes Ferris, whose roof had been marked as repaired in Colton's records but which, on closer inspection, still let in rain through a gap wide enough to fit a hand through. Agnes answered the door wrapped in 2 shawls against the cold, startled to find the Duke himself standing on her doorstep, and even more startled when Margaret asked, gently and without any trace of pity, how long she had been living with the leak and why she had never sent word to the house. I sent word twice, Your Grace, Agnes admitted, glancing nervously at Elias. Mr. Colton said the repairs were scheduled. I did not think it was my place to ask again. Elias's jaw tightened, and Margaret watched something shift in his face, a private, quiet anger directed entirely at himself for not knowing sooner. He promised Agnes the roof would be repaired within the week, properly this time, and true to his word, sent workmen out the very next morning. They visited 3 more cottages that day, each with some small complaint that had gone unheard for months: a broken fence, a well that needed clearing, a family with 5 children sharing 2 thin blankets through the coldest part of winter. By the time they turned their horses back toward the hall, the sun had begun to set, painting the fields in shades of orange and gray, and Elias rode in silence for a long while before finally speaking. I did not know, he said, any of it. I have lived on this land my whole life, and I did not know how my own people were living. You know now, Margaret said simply. That is what matters going forward. He glanced at her, something like gratitude in his expression, though he did not know how to put it into words, and instead simply nodded and rode on beside her, the two of them falling into a silence that felt, for the first time, less like distance and more like companionship. That evening, over dinner, the conversation came more easily than it had before. Elias asked about her childhood, about the small parish where her father preached, and Margaret found herself telling him stories she had not shared with anyone in years, about nursing her father through a fever so severe the physician had given up hope, about teaching herself to manage accounts because her father could never bring himself to refuse anyone who asked for help, even when the family could not afford it. "And your brother?" Elias asked. "Henry, was it? He looked as though he wanted to strike me at the wedding." Margaret laughed, the first real laugh Elias had heard from her since her arrival, bright and unguarded. "He very likely did," she admitted. "Henry has never trusted anyone above our own station. He grew up watching wealthy men make promises to our father that were never kept, tithes withheld, debts forgiven in words but never in writing. He assumed you would be no different." "And what does he think now?" Elias asked. "I have not told him about the roofs, or the accounts, or any of it," Margaret said. "But I intend to write to him this week. I think he will be surprised." Elias found himself smiling, a small, unfamiliar motion at the corner of his mouth. "I should like to meet him properly one day, without a wedding and a furious father standing between us." "He sounds like a good man," Elias said, returning to the earlier thread of conversation about the Reverend. "He is," Margaret said, "though I fear he worries more about others than himself. It is why I agreed to this marriage in the first place. I could not watch him work himself into an early grave over debts that were never truly his to carry alone." Elias was quiet for a moment, turning his glass slowly between his fingers. "I am glad, in a strange way, that my father's cruelty led me to that fare," he said eventually. "I do not think I would have found the courage to ask for anything different otherwise." Margaret did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, but she felt the words settle somewhere warm inside her chest, a small and unfamiliar comfort in a house that had, until recently, offered her none. As the days passed into weeks, the two of them settled into a rhythm neither had expected. Mornings were spent on estate business, Margaret reviewing accounts and meeting with tenants, Elias handling correspondence and the slow, careful work of repairing relationships his father had damaged with neighboring families. Afternoons, when the weather allowed, they rode together, and evenings ended with dinner conversations that grew longer and easier with each passing day. But even as the household began to settle, and even as something unspoken and fragile began to grow between them, Margaret could not shake the sense that they were being watched, that somewhere beyond the estate's gates, the old Duke was waiting, patient and furious, for the first sign of weakness he could use to tear the marriage apart before spring arrived. Spring was still weeks away, but Margaret had begun to notice the days growing slightly longer, the frost on the windows melting a little earlier each morning, and with it came a growing awareness that the old Duke's deadline was drawing closer whether she was ready for it or not. She had written to Henry twice since arriving at Culross Hall, careful letters describing the estate, the tenants, the slow work of repairing what Colton had broken, though she had said little of Elias himself, unsure how to explain a marriage that had begun as a transaction and was becoming something she did not yet have words for. Henry's reply arrived on a cold morning, his handwriting cramped and hurried as always, and Margaret read it twice before setting it aside with a small, relieved smile. He wrote that their father's health had improved slightly since the debts had been settled, that the physician visited weekly now instead of only when summoned in desperation, and that he himself had been offered a position as a clerk in a solicitor's office in the county town, the first real opportunity of his life, made possible entirely by the money Margaret's marriage had provided. He wrote, too, with grudging honesty, that perhaps he had judged the Duke too harshly at the wedding, though he reserved the right to change his opinion again if given cause. Margaret carried the letter with her for the rest of the day, a small piece of proof that whatever else this marriage cost her, it had already done what she had married for in the first place, kept her family whole. It was this letter, tucked into her sleeve for comfort, that she carried with her to the assembly that evening, though she could not have known how much she would need the reminder before the night was through. The invitation had arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, thick cream paper stamped with the seal of the county assembly, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten the moment she read the name listed among the hosts, Lady Beatrice Fenwick, an old friend of the Ashworth family, and, as Margaret would soon learn, a woman entirely loyal to the old Duke. "We do not have to attend," Elias said, watching her face as she read the card a second time. "We do," Margaret said. If we hide from society now, we confirm every rumor your father has already begun to spread. I would rather stand in front of them and prove him wrong. She had heard the whispers by then, carried back to Culross Hall through servants who overheard gossip in the village, through letters from acquaintances who felt obligated to warn her. The old Duke had been busy in the weeks since the wedding, visiting neighboring estates, hosting small dinners, dropping careful remarks about the new Duchess, a nobody, a fortune hunter, a clergyman's daughter who had trapped his son into a marriage beneath his station. None of it was true, but truth mattered little when repeated often enough by a man with the old Duke's standing. The assembly hall was already crowded with candlelight and conversation when Margaret and Elias arrived, and she felt the shift in the room the moment they stepped through the door, heads turning, voices dropping to whispers behind raised fans. She kept her chin level and her shoulders back, though her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. Lady Fenwick approached almost immediately, her smile sharp as a blade disguised as courtesy. "Your Grace," she said to Elias, before turning to Margaret with a look that swept from her simple gown to her unadorned neck. "And this must be your new Duchess. How very unexpected your marriage was. I confess we all wondered at the haste." "There was nothing hasty about it," Margaret said, keeping her voice pleasant and steady. "My husband and I simply knew our own minds quickly. I understand that can seem strange to those who take longer to decide anything at all." A ripple of amusement passed through the small crowd that had gathered to listen, and Lady Fenwick's smile thinned considerably before she excused herself with a stiff nod. Elias glanced at Margaret with something close to admiration, though the moment did not last long. Later in the evening, when the musicians began a slow dance and couples moved onto the floor, Elias surprised her by offering his hand. "I do not dance often," he admitted, "but I think it would do us both good to be seen enjoying an evening rather than merely enduring it." Margaret accepted, though she confessed she had little practice herself, and for a few minutes, moving carefully through the steps, she nearly forgot the whispers following them around the edges of the room. Elias was not a graceful dancer, and neither was she, and there was something almost freeing in that shared clumsiness, a small private joke between two people who had agreed, at the start, to expect nothing from each other, and were slowly discovering they wanted more. "You dance like a man counting numbers in his head," Margaret said, laughing softly as he missed a turn. "I am counting numbers in my head," he admitted. "It is the only way I remember the steps." For a moment, watching him smile properly for what felt like the first time since she had known him, Margaret allowed herself to forget the letter from the old Duke that would arrive the following morning, and simply enjoyed the warmth of his hand in hers and the unfamiliar lightness in her chest. But the dance ended, and the whispers returned, and within the hour they had grown bolder, no longer bothering to lower their voices when Margaret passed. "I heard her father sold her to clear his debts," one woman murmured to another, not quite quietly enough. "I heard she cannot even read music," said a second voice, though I suppose that hardly matters when one marries for money instead of accomplishment. Margaret felt each comment like a small, precise cut, but she forced herself to keep walking, to keep her expression calm, refusing to give the room the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. It was only when a young man she did not recognize, clearly emboldened by drink and the general mood of the evening, stepped directly into her path, that her composure nearly broke. "Tell me, Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying further than he perhaps intended. "Was it difficult, convincing a duke to marry so far beneath him? I understand your father could barely afford the wedding clothes." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how she would respond, and Margaret opened her mouth to answer, though she was not entirely certain what words would come out. Before she could speak, Elias appeared at her side, his presence sudden and solid, his voice low but carrying an edge sharp enough to silence the nearest onlookers. "You will apologize to my wife," he said, "or you will leave this hall tonight and explain to your father why you are no longer welcome at any gathering I attend in the future." The young man's face went pale, stammering an apology before retreating quickly into the crowd, and the room's attention shifted entirely, no longer amused whispers but something closer to shock. A duke, publicly and forcefully defending a wife everyone had assumed he barely tolerated, was not the story anyone in that room had expected to witness that evening. Margaret said nothing until they had stepped outside into the cool night air, waiting for their carriage, and even then, she found herself struggling to find the right words. "Thank you," she finally managed. "You did not need my help," Elias said. "You were handling it well enough on your own." "Perhaps," she said, "but it was easier, knowing you stood beside me." Elias looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, the careful distance he usually kept softening just slightly. My father taught me that showing anyone your feelings was a weakness to be exploited, he said quietly. I have spent most of my life believing him. Tonight, watching those people speak to you that way, I found I did not care whether it was weak to feel angry on your behalf. I simply felt it. Margaret studied his face in the dim light of the carriage lamps, and something in her chest loosened, a tension she had carried since the wedding day beginning, slowly, to ease. Tell me about her, she said softly. Your mother. Not the version your father allows people to remember, the real one. Elias was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret worried she had pushed too far, too soon. But then he began to speak, hesitantly at first, his voice growing steadier as the words came easier. She used to sing to me, he said, when I was young enough to still be afraid of the dark. My father thought it was foolish, encouraging weakness, he called it, but she did it anyway, every night, until I was old enough that I pretended I no longer needed it, though I still did, for years after she was sent away. She had a way of making the coldest room feel warm simply by being in it. I used to think that was some kind of magic. I understand now it was simply kindness, which this family has always mistaken for weakness. What happened exactly? Margaret asked gently. The night she was sent away. My father accused her of loving another man, Elias said. A neighboring landowner, someone she had known since childhood. I do not know if it was true. I was 12 years old, and no one thought to explain anything to me beyond the fact that she was gone and I was never to speak of her again. I found out years later, through a servant who still remembered her fondly, that my father had never actually caught her in any wrongdoing. He simply grew tired of her kindness making him look weak in front of his peers, and used the rumor as an excuse to remove her. Margaret felt something hot and furious rise in her chest on behalf of a woman she had never met. That is monstrous, she said. It is the only version of love my father understands, Elias said. Control disguised as devotion. He believes affection given freely is affection wasted. I have spent my whole life trying not to become him, and some days I am not certain I have succeeded. You have succeeded tonight, Margaret said. Any man who would have simply let those people speak to me as they did is not the man you fear becoming. Elias reached across the small space of the carriage and took her hand, hesitantly, as though unsure whether the gesture would be welcome, and Margaret did not pull away. They rode the rest of the journey back to Culross Hall in silence, her hand resting in his, both of them quietly aware that something between them had shifted, something neither of them was yet ready to name aloud, but that neither of them wished to undo. The following morning, a letter arrived from the old Duke, delivered by a servant who refused to meet Margaret's eyes as he handed it over. Elias read it in the study, his expression darkening line by line, and when Margaret asked what it contained, he handed it to her without a word. The letter was brief and cold, congratulating Elias on his public display of affection at the assembly, and warning that such performances would not save the marriage from what was coming. The old Duke wrote that he had engaged a solicitor to examine the circumstances of the wedding itself, hinting at irregularities in the parish records that might, with the right pressure applied, be enough to have the marriage annulled entirely. He is bluffing, Elias said, though his voice lacked full conviction. There is nothing irregular about our marriage. Perhaps not, Margaret said, folding the letter carefully. But your father has never needed the truth to cause damage. He only needs enough doubt to make people believe there might be truth in it. Elias took the letter back from her and stared at it for a long moment before feeding it into the fire, watching the paper curl and blacken at the edges. Whatever he attempts, he said, I will not let him succeed. Not this time. Later that day, Margaret sought out Mrs. Dunmore in the kitchens, hoping the older woman might know more about the solicitor the old Duke had mentioned, or at least about the parish records he intended to question. Mrs. Dunmore set down the linens she was folding and studied Margaret carefully before speaking. I have served this family since before Elias was born, Your Grace, she said. I watched what happened to his mother, and I promised myself, quietly, that I would never again stand by silently while that man destroyed another good woman in this house. Then help me understand him, Margaret said. What is he capable of, truly? Mrs. Dunmore was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words with visible care. He is capable of anything that serves his pride, she said finally. He does not care for truth. He cares for outcomes. If he believes he can end this marriage through paperwork and rumor, he will pursue it without hesitation, and he will feel no guilt at all for the damage it causes, because in his mind, the damage will always be someone else's fault. Margaret thanked her and returned to the study, where she found Elias still staring into the fire where the letter had burned to ash. She told him what Mrs. Dunmore had said, and he nodded slowly, unsurprised. She is not wrong, he said. I spent my childhood watching him convince an entire county that sending my mother away was an act of mercy on his part, rather than cruelty. He has a talent for rewriting the truth until even the people who witnessed it begin to doubt their own memory. Then we will need proof he cannot rewrite, Margaret said. Records, witnesses, something solid enough that even his talent for persuasion cannot bend it. Elias looked at her, something steady and grateful in his expression. You speak as though this is a battle we are fighting together, he said. It is, Margaret said simply. Whatever this marriage began as, I did not agree to stand alone in it, and I do not intend to start now. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not of the old Duke's threats, but of the dance, of Elias's hand in hers, of the small, unguarded smile that had crossed his face before the whispers returned. She did not yet know what to call the feeling growing quietly inside her, only that it frightened her slightly, that a marriage begun so coldly and so deliberately without love might, despite every careful intention on both their parts, be turning into something else entirely. A knock at the study door interrupted Margaret's work on the estate ledgers, and she looked up to find Elias's face pale, a folded letter clutched in his hand, the wax seal already broken. Henry is being questioned, he said, before she could ask what had happened. Margaret rose so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. What do you mean, questioned? By whom? My father's solicitor, Elias said. He has traveled to the county town where your brother works and offered him money, a significant sum, in exchange for a signed statement claiming our marriage was arranged under pressure, that your father forced the match to escape his debts, and that you never freely consented to it. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Henry would never agree to such a lie. I do not believe he has, Elias said quickly, seeing her alarm. My father's letter boasts of the offer as though it were already accepted, but I suspect that is simply his usual habit of announcing victories he has not yet won. I have already sent word to Henry directly, asking him to write to us the moment he has approached if he has not been already. Margaret sat back down, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the ledger page in front of her without truly seeing it. Why would he do this? She asked. He has tried rumor. He has tried a solicitor questioning the parish records. Now he tries to buy my own brother's testimony against me. What more does he intend? Elias's jaw tightened. He intends to win, he said. By whatever method proves effective. He has never cared for the cost, only the outcome. That evening, a reply arrived from Henry, hastily written but firm, confirming that a man claiming to represent the old Duke had indeed approached him with an offer of £50 in exchange for a signed statement, and that Henry had refused outright, throwing the man out of the solicitor's office where he worked and threatening to report the attempted bribery to his employer. Margaret read the letter aloud to Elias, relief washing through her, though it did little to ease the deeper worry settling in her chest. He failed this time, she said, but he will try again, with someone else perhaps, someone with less loyalty than my brother. Elias did not answer immediately, and Margaret noticed, not for the first time, a particular stillness that came over him whenever his father was discussed at length, a kind of frozen hesitation that she had initially mistaken for calm but was beginning to understand as something closer to old, deep fear. We should confront him directly, Margaret said, before he grows bolder. Not yet, Elias said. If we move too soon, without solid proof of his interference, he will simply deny everything and claim we are the ones spreading lies about him. We need to wait until his actions leave a trail he cannot talk his way around. Margaret studied him carefully, sensing something beneath his caution that troubled her more than the strategy itself. You are afraid of him, she said quietly, even now. Elias's expression flickered, a brief crack in his composure before he smoothed it over again. I have spent my entire life being afraid of him, he admitted. It is not something I know how to simply stop feeling. Even when I know I am no longer a child he can control through fear alone. Margaret reached across the desk and covered his hand with hers, a gesture that had become easier between them in recent weeks, though it still carried a small, careful weight each time. Then let me help carry it, she said. You do not have to face him alone. Elias looked at their joined hands for a long moment before answering, but the answer, when it came, was not the reassurance she had hoped for. I appreciate the offer, he said, withdrawing his hand gently, but this is a fight between my father and myself. It has been for 20 years. I will not ask you to bear the weight of something that began long before you and I ever met. Margaret felt the withdrawal like a small, cold shock, though she said nothing, simply nodding and returning her attention to the ledger in front of her, the warmth of the previous weeks suddenly feeling more distant than it had that morning. She understood, in a way she could not quite put into words, that Elias's caution was not a rejection of her, but an old habit of protecting the people he cared for by keeping them at a careful distance, the same instinct that had likely governed every relationship he had ever tried to build since his mother was taken from him. But understanding the reason did not entirely soften the sting. Over the following days, a quiet tension settled between them that had not existed since the earliest days of the marriage. Elias grew more withdrawn, spending long hours in the study reviewing old estate documents and correspondence, searching, Margaret suspected, for some proof of his father's interference that he could use without endangering anyone else. Margaret, for her part, threw herself back into the household work that had once given her comfort, though she found herself watching Elias across the dinner table each evening with a growing unease she could not fully name. It was Mrs. Dunmore, of all people, who finally addressed the shift directly, finding Margaret alone in the small parlor one afternoon, mending a torn hem with more concentration than the task truly required. "You have gone quiet again, Your Grace," the housekeeper observed. "Much as you were in your first week here." "I am simply tired," Margaret said, though the excuse sounded thin even to her own ears. Mrs. Dunmore sat down across from her, an unusual familiarity for a woman who had spent weeks maintaining careful professional distance. "His Grace does this," she said, "when he is afraid. He pulls inward, tries to carry every burden alone, believing that asking for help is the same as admitting weakness his father can exploit. I watched him do it as a boy, after his mother left, refusing comfort from anyone, even those of us who genuinely wished to offer it." Margaret set down her needle. "Do you think he will ever learn to do otherwise?" "That," Mrs. Dunmore said carefully, "likely depends on whether someone is patient enough to keep offering, even when he pushes it away." Margaret considered the words long after Mrs. Dunmore had returned to her duties, turning them over as she finished the mending, as she walked the cold garden paths alone that evening, as she lay awake later that night listening to the distant, restless sound of Elias pacing in the study below her window, unable to sleep. The following morning brought worse news still. A letter arrived from Margaret's father, his handwriting shaky but urgent, warning that a stranger claiming to represent legal interests in the Ashworth family had visited the parish, questioning the old parish clerk about the exact wording used in the marriage register, hinting that any irregularity, however minor, might be enough to challenge the legitimacy of the union entirely. The old clerk, frightened and confused, had apparently given answers that were vague enough to be twisted in either direction, depending on who asked the questions afterward. Margaret brought the letter directly to Elias, finding him once again buried in old documents, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He read it twice before setting it down and rubbing a hand over his face. "He is building a case," Elias said, "piece by piece. A questioned clerk here, a bribed witness there. Individually, none of it proves anything. Together, presented to the right people, it could be enough to cast real doubt. Then we stop reacting to each piece separately," Margaret said, "and start building a defense of our own, together, before he assembles enough pieces to move against us properly." Elias looked at her for a long moment, and something in his exhausted expression finally softened, the careful distance of the past days cracking slightly under the weight of everything pressing in around them. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "for pulling away when you offered to help. It was not fair to you, and it did not even succeed in protecting either of us from what has continued regardless." Margaret moved around the desk and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Then let us face the rest of it properly," she said. "Together, as we should have from the start." Elias reached into a drawer and withdrew a fresh sheet of paper. "If he intends to build a case against us piece by piece," he said, "then we will need our own record, one we control, showing every attempt he has made so far, the bribery of your brother, the pressure on the parish clerk, the questions raised without any true evidence behind them. If he ever brings this before anyone with real authority, we will be ready with proof of exactly how far he has already gone to manufacture a case that does not exist." Margaret nodded, already reaching for the letters scattered across the desk, sorting them by date with quick, practiced hands. "We should also speak with the parish clerk ourselves," she said, "before your father's solicitor returns to pressure him further. If he understands that we know what has been asked of him, he may be less willing to let his words be twisted a second time." "I will ride out tomorrow," Elias said. "Will you come with me?" Margaret looked up, faintly surprised by the question, though she should not have been. "Of course," she said. "I told you already, I do not intend to stand apart from this." They spent the following days working side by side in the study, spreading old letters and estate records across the wide desk, searching for anything that might expose the true history behind the old Duke's treatment of his late wife, evidence that could be used, if necessary, to show a pattern of cruelty and manipulation that stretched back decades, and might make his current accusations against Margaret appear exactly as they were, a desperate continuation of old habits, rather than a genuine concern for propriety. It was Margaret who found the first real piece of evidence, tucked inside an old ledger from the year Elias's mother had been sent away. A payment recorded to a physician for what the entry vaguely described as treatment for nervous exhaustion, followed weeks later by a second, larger payment to the same physician, marked simply as discretion. "Elias, look at this," she said, sliding the ledger across the desk toward him. He read the entries twice, his face growing pale. "My father paid a physician to certify her as unwell," he said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. Not because she was ill, but because it gave him grounds to send her away without scandal attaching to his own name. He built the entire story of her breakdown around a bribe. "If we can find the physician, or any record of what he was actually paid to say," Margaret said, "it would prove your father has used exactly this kind of deception before. It would make any claim he brings against our marriage look exactly like what it is." Elias sat back, staring at the ledger entry, as though it might rearrange itself into something less painful the longer he looked at it. "I always wondered," he said quietly, "why she never fought harder to stay, to see me, to explain her side of things. I used to think it meant the accusations were true, that some part of her guilt kept her from returning. I never once considered that my father might have simply paid to make certain no one would believe her if she tried." Margaret reached for his hand again, and this time he did not pull away. "I am sorry," she said, "that you carried that belief for so long." "I am not certain what to feel now," Elias admitted. "Anger, certainly, but also something like grief, for a version of my childhood I never actually had, a mother who might have stayed and fought for me, if she had believed anyone would listen." They spent the rest of the afternoon compiling what they had found, cross-referencing dates and payments, building a quiet, careful record that Elias locked away in a private drawer of the desk, evidence he intended to hold in reserve, a weapon to be used only if his father forced the confrontation into the open. Margaret watched him work with a growing respect for the careful, methodical way he approached the problem, so different from the cold, distant man she had married weeks earlier, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time, when exactly the distance between them had begun to close. That evening, as they finally set aside the papers and allowed themselves a quiet dinner, Elias spoke without quite meeting her eyes. "I do not know how to properly thank you," he said, "for staying through all of this. You did not marry into a simple life. I imagine there were easier paths available to you, even given your family's circumstances." "There were," Margaret admitted, "but none of them would have taught me what I know now, about myself, and about the kind of person I wanted to become when everything around me was uncertain. I do not regret this marriage, Elias, whatever else comes of it." Elias looked at her then, truly looked at her, in a way that made Margaret's breath catch slightly in her throat, though neither of them spoke further on the matter that evening, both aware that something significant had shifted between them, something neither was yet ready to name aloud, but that both, quietly, hoped would remain. The invitation to dinner at the old Duke's residence arrived with none of the usual courtesies, no warm greeting, no polite inquiry after their health, only a curt line stating that matters concerning the family required their presence the following evening, and that refusal would be noted as an admission of guilt regarding accusations already circulating among their peers. "He wants an audience," Elias said, reading the letter a second time. "He would not summon us to his home alone. He intends to have witnesses present, people whose opinions matter to society, so that whatever he plans to accuse us of carries weight beyond his word alone." "Then we bring our own proof," Margaret said, "and let his audience witness something other than what he intends." They spent the following day preparing, reviewing every document they had gathered over the past weeks. The falsified ledger entries proving the physician's bribe, letters confirming the attempted purchase of Henry's testimony, a signed statement from the parish clerk, given freely once he understood the pressure being placed upon him, and the danger of aligning himself with a lie. Elias arranged for a trusted family solicitor, a man who had served the estate honestly for years despite the old Duke's efforts to remove him, to attend the dinner as well, ready to speak on the legal standing of the marriage should the question arise. Before they left Culross Hall that evening, Margaret paused in the hallway before the bare space on the wall where a portrait had once hung, the space she had noticed on her very first night in the house. She had learned enough by now to know it had once held an image of Elias's mother, removed the same year the physician's payments had been recorded. "We will hang a new portrait there one day," Elias said, coming to stand beside her. "Of her. Once this is finished, once my father no longer has any power to erase her memory a second time. I would like that, Margaret said, and meant it, though a small, unfamiliar ache moved through her at the thought of a woman who had never gotten the chance to fight for herself the way Margaret now intended to fight for her. They arrived at the old Duke's residence to find the dining room already filled with a dozen guests, familiar faces from the assembly. Lady Fenwick seated prominently near the head of the table, her expression carefully arranged into something between sympathy and anticipation. The old Duke rose as they entered, his smile thin and sharp, the smile of a man who believed the evening's outcome was already decided in his favor. "My son and his Duchess," he announced to the room, loud enough that every conversation stilled to listen. "How good of you to join us, given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" Elias asked, his voice level, though Margaret could feel the tension radiating from him as they took their seats. The old Duke did not answer immediately, waiting instead until the first course had been served and the room's attention had settled fully upon him, before producing a folded document from beneath his own plate, with a flourish clearly rehearsed for maximum effect. "I have here a sworn statement," he announced, "from the parish clerk who oversaw your hasty wedding, confirming irregularities in the marriage register that call into serious question whether the ceremony was ever properly recorded at all." A murmur passed through the assembled guests, and Margaret felt every eye in the room turn toward her, waiting for her reaction. She kept her expression calm, remembering the promise she had made to herself weeks earlier, that she would not be the one to flinch first. "That statement is false," Elias said. "Or rather, it is true only in the sense that the clerk was pressured into vague answers by a solicitor you sent to question him under false pretenses. A serious accusation," the old Duke said smoothly, "against a man of law simply performing his duty." Margaret rose from her seat, and the room's attention shifted to her, some guests visibly startled by the boldness of a young duchess standing to address her husband's father directly at his own table. "Perhaps, Your Grace, we should hear from the clerk himself," she said, and produced her own document, a signed statement obtained the previous day, in which the elderly clerk confirmed precisely how the questioning had unfolded, the leading nature of the solicitor's inquiries, the implied threat that his position might be jeopardized if his answers did not support a particular conclusion. The old Duke's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly. "A statement easily obtained through your own pressure," he said. "Who is to say which version is the truth?" "Then let us discuss truth further," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, and set a second document upon the table, the ledger entry detailing the payment made to a physician years earlier, alongside the discreet second payment marked plainly for silence. The room fell entirely quiet. The old Duke's face, for the first time since they had arrived, showed something other than smug control. "This concerns a private family matter from many years ago," he said, his voice tighter now. "It has no bearing on tonight's discussion." "It has every bearing," Elias said, standing beside his wife, his voice carrying a cold, controlled fury Margaret had not yet heard from him. "It proves a pattern, Father. A pattern of manufacturing evidence to destroy the women in this family, whenever their kindness threatened your control. You did it to my mother, and you are attempting it again now, with my wife." Lady Fenwick shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and several other guests exchanged uneasy glances, the mood of the room having shifted entirely from anticipation of a scandal to something closer to genuine discomfort at witnessing one unfold in real time. "You know nothing of what happened with your mother," the old Duke said, his composure cracking further. "I know she was never given the chance to defend herself," Elias said. "I know a physician was paid to certify a story that suited your purposes rather than the truth. And I know that whatever guilt you have carried for that these past 16 years, you have chosen, again and again, to bury it beneath cruelty, rather than face it honestly." The old Duke's hands trembled slightly against the table, though whether from anger or something closer to shame, Margaret could not tell. He opened his mouth to respond, but Elias continued before he could speak, his voice growing steadier with each word. "I have spent my entire life afraid of you," he said, "afraid of your disapproval, afraid of losing whatever scraps of approval you occasionally offered, afraid enough that I let you dictate the terms of my own marriage before I finally chose to defy you outright. But I am no longer that frightened boy, and I will not allow you to destroy this marriage, or this family's remaining reputation, through lies you have manufactured out of nothing but wounded pride." The family solicitor, seated quietly near the end of the table, cleared his throat and spoke for the first time that evening, confirming in careful legal terms that the marriage register showed no genuine irregularity, that any claim brought forward based on the current evidence would collapse quickly under proper scrutiny, and that the attempted bribery of a witness, should it be formally reported, carried serious consequences of its own for whoever had arranged it. The old Duke looked around the table, taking in the faces of his guests, the guests he had invited specifically to witness his triumph, and found instead expressions ranging from discomfort to open disapproval. Lady Fenwick would not meet his eyes at all. "This marriage will still fail," the old Duke said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier force. "Mark my words. Without my support, without my influence, you will find society far less forgiving than you imagine." "We do not require your support," Elias said. "We never truly did. We required only your absence from our lives, and that, Father, is precisely what you will have from this evening forward. I am severing your involvement in the management of this estate entirely, effective immediately, and I will be informing our solicitors of the same in writing tomorrow morning." "You are still my son," the old Duke said, his voice suddenly quieter, almost pleading in a way Margaret had never heard from him before. "Whatever else you believe of me, that has never changed. Everything I have done to protect this family's name." "You have protected nothing," Elias said. "You have only ever protected your own comfort, your own image, at the cost of everyone who loved you honestly. My mother loved you honestly, once, before you taught her that love was dangerous in this house. I will not let you teach my wife the same lesson." The old Duke's face crumpled slightly, some old grief surfacing beneath the anger, gone again almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar hardness Margaret had come to expect from him. "You will regret this," he said, though the threat carried none of its earlier weight. "Both of you will regret turning your backs on everything this family could offer you." "We already have everything that matters," Margaret said quietly. "Each other. And the truth. You are the only one at this table who has neither." The old Duke stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and for a moment Margaret thought he might strike his own son, but instead he simply gathered what remained of his composure and walked from the room without another word, leaving his own dinner party in stunned silence behind him. Lady Fenwick rose slowly from her seat near the head of the table, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the careful, calculating expression of a woman, recalculating where her loyalties ought to lie, now that the balance of power in the room had so visibly shifted. "Your Grace," she said to Margaret, her voice noticeably softer than it had been at the assembly weeks earlier. "I confess I may have spoken hastily on previous occasions, believing rumors I ought to have questioned more carefully." Margaret regarded her evenly, neither warm nor cold. "Rumors are easy to believe when they are repeated often enough by someone with your standing, Lady Fenwick," she said. "I hope, in future, you will consider the source before lending your voice to them." The older woman had the grace to look genuinely embarrassed and murmured a stiff apology before retreating toward the door, leaving Margaret with a small, quiet satisfaction that surprised her. Not triumph exactly, but something close to the relief of finally being seen clearly after weeks of being dismissed at a glance. Other guests offered similarly awkward apologies as they gathered their coats, a few outright refusing to meet the old Duke's eyes as they passed him near the door, and Margaret understood, watching the room empty, that whatever influence the old man had once held over county society had weakened considerably in the space of a single evening, undone by his own arrogance and the simple, stubborn refusal of his son's wife to be frightened into silence. The remaining guests dispersed quickly and awkwardly after that, murmuring polite excuses, and Margaret and Elias found themselves standing together in the now nearly empty dining room, the weight of what had just happened settling slowly over both of them. "You did it," Margaret said quietly. "You finally stood up to him." "We did it," Elias corrected, and for a moment something like relief passed across his face, the first true relaxation she had seen in him since the wedding day. As they gathered their coats to leave, Margaret overheard Elias speaking quietly to the family solicitor near the door, his voice pitched low enough that he clearly did not intend for her to hear. "I do not know what I would have done without her steadiness tonight," Elias said. "This marriage began only as an act of defiance against my father, a foolish decision made in anger. But somewhere along the way it became the one thing in my life that feels entirely true, and I—" Margaret did not hear the rest. A servant approached her at that exact moment with her cloak, and by the time she turned back, Elias had already finished his conversation and was crossing the room toward her, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. The carriage ride home passed in a strange, heavy silence. Margaret stared out the window at the dark countryside, the words she had overheard circling endlessly in her mind. This marriage began only as an act of defiance against my father. She knew, rationally, that this was simply the truth of how it had started, a truth she had known and accepted from the very first day, standing among the stalls of the village fair. But hearing it spoken aloud now, after everything that had passed between them in the weeks since, after the dance, after the ledger entries uncovered together, after his hand covering hers across the desk, the words settled into her chest like a stone she could not dislodge. She did not hear what he had said after her name, whatever qualifier or explanation might have followed, and in the exhausted, uncertain hours after the confrontation, her mind filled the silence with the worst possibility it could imagine, that whatever had grown between them these past weeks was, to him, still secondary to the war he had waged against his father, that she had been, and perhaps still remained, more instrument than wife. By the time they reached Culross Hall, Margaret had made a quiet, painful decision, one she did not share with Elias that night, retreating instead to her room with a brief, distracted good night that he seemed too exhausted from the evening's events to question. She thought of her aunt in the north, her mother's sister, a widow living alone in a small cottage near the border, a woman who had written to Margaret once, years earlier, offering a standing invitation to visit whenever she wished. It would not be a life of comfort, certainly nothing like Culross Hall, but it would be a life of her own choosing, free from the quiet ache of loving a man who had perhaps never chosen her for herself at all, only as a weapon against a father who no longer deserved even that much of his attention. She told herself, as she finally undressed and climbed into the cold, unfamiliar bed, that she was being sensible, protecting herself before the hurt could grow any deeper than it already had. But some smaller, quieter part of her, the part that still remembered the warmth of his hand across the desk and the sound of his laughter during their clumsy dance, wondered whether she was making a decision out of wisdom or simply out of fear, and whether there might have been more to his unfinished sentence than the words she had actually heard. Sleep did not come easily that night, and long after the candles in the study below had finally gone dark, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, turning the same unanswered question over and over in her mind, until exhaustion finally claimed her sometime near dawn. 3 weeks passed after the confrontation at the old Duke's residence, and Culross Hall settled into a strange, quiet peace that Margaret found she could not fully trust. Word had spread quickly through the county that the old Duke's schemes had collapsed publicly and thoroughly, and with that collapse came a shift in how society treated the young Duchess. Invitations arriving with genuine warmth now rather than curiosity. Tenants greeting her in the village with open respect rather than cautious politeness. Everything, on the surface, had finally settled in their favor. And yet Margaret felt herself growing more distant with each passing day, not from any single decision but from 100 small choices. Staying later in the study reviewing accounts long after Elias had retired. Finding reasons to visit tenant cottages alone rather than together. Answering his questions at dinner with short, careful replies that discouraged further conversation. She told herself she was simply protecting the plans she had quietly begun to make, the letters she had started drafting to her aunt in the north, though she had not yet found the courage to send them. Elias noticed the change, of course, though he seemed uncertain how to address it, likely assuming, Margaret realized later, that she was simply exhausted from the strain of recent weeks, needing space and quiet rather than distance born of hurt. He gave her that space, patiently, unknowingly widening the very gap she was trying to create, until nearly 3 weeks had passed with barely a real conversation between them. A letter arrived from Henry during this quiet, uncertain stretch, full of genuine warmth for the first time since the wedding, describing his growing success at the solicitor's office, and thanking Margaret again for the opportunity her marriage had provided him. He wrote, almost as an afterthought near the end of the letter, that he hoped to visit Culross Hall before summer. Curious now, he admitted, to properly meet the man his sister had married under such strange circumstances. Margaret read the letter twice, comforted by her brother's happiness, though it only deepened the ache of her own uncertain situation, a marriage that looked, from the outside, exactly like the success story Henry believed it to be, while privately she felt herself drifting further from the one person who might have reassured her otherwise. She considered, more than once during those weeks, simply asking Elias directly what he had meant that night, but each time the opportunity presented itself, at breakfast, in the garden, across the long dinner table, her courage failed her, replaced by a quiet, familiar fear that asking might only confirm the very thing she dreaded hearing. It was easier, she told herself, to simply prepare a graceful retreat than to risk a direct answer she might not be able to bear. It was Mrs. Dunmore, once again, who forced the matter into the open, finding Margaret in her rooms one afternoon in early spring, folding a small collection of dresses into a modest trunk with careful, deliberate movements. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said slowly, taking in the scene before her, "are you leaving us?" Margaret paused, a dress still in her hands, caught entirely without an explanation ready. "I am simply organizing my things," she said, though the lie sounded weak even as she spoke it. Mrs. Dunmore closed the door behind her and crossed the room, her expression uncharacteristically gentle. "I have watched 2 duchesses pass through this house now," she said. "I will not watch a second one leave without at least asking why, when the man downstairs has done nothing these past weeks but wonder what he did wrong." Margaret set the dress down slowly, feeling the careful composure she had maintained for weeks finally beginning to crack. "I overheard him, the night of the dinner," she admitted, speaking to the solicitor. "He said the marriage began only as an act of defiance against his father. I did not hear the rest of what he said, and I have spent every day since wondering if there was anything else to hear at all, or if that was simply the whole truth of it, spoken honestly when he believed no one who mattered was listening." Mrs. Dunmore was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret with an expression that seemed to weigh several responses before finally settling on the plainest one available. "And you did not think to simply ask him," she said. Margaret felt the foolishness of the past 3 weeks settle over her all at once, plain and undeniable now that someone else had spoken it aloud. "I was afraid of the answer," she admitted quietly. Mrs. Dunmore reached out and gently took the half-packed trunk's lid, closing it with a soft final click. "Fear built this family's tragedies before, Your Grace," she said. "His mother's silence, his father's cruelty, all of it rooted in people too afraid to simply say what needed saying, until it was far too late to matter. I would hate to see history repeat itself under this roof a second time." Margaret sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the trunk closed but not yet unpacked, her earlier certainty about leaving suddenly feeling far less solid than it had that morning. "He is in the study," Mrs. Dunmore added, moving toward the door. "He has been there most evenings since the dinner, working later than he needs to, I think because the house feels too quiet otherwise." She left Margaret alone with the closed trunk and the weight of a decision that suddenly felt far more complicated than it had an hour earlier. That evening, Elias returned to his rooms later than usual, his mind still occupied with a difficult letter to a neighboring landowner about shared boundary repairs, and it was only when he reached for a fresh shirt in his dressing room that he noticed, through the connecting door left slightly ajar, the trunk sitting closed and ready at the foot of Margaret's bed. He stood frozen for a long moment, staring at it, before crossing the room and knocking softly on her door, though she had not yet retired for the evening and answered almost immediately, clearly startled by the urgency in his knock. "Are you leaving?" he asked, his voice unsteady in a way Margaret had never heard from him before, not even during the confrontation with his father. Margaret hesitated, torn between the careful distance she had maintained for weeks and the plain honesty Mrs. Dunmore had urged upon her that afternoon, and finally chose honesty. "I had considered it," she said. "I still do not know entirely what I intend." "Why?" Elias asked, though something in his expression suggested he already feared the answer. Margaret took a steadying breath. "The night of the dinner," she said, "I heard you speaking to the solicitor. You said this marriage began only as an act of defiance against your father. I did not hear anything after that. I have spent 3 weeks wondering whether there was anything else to hear, or whether that was simply the truth of it." Elias's face went through several expressions in quick succession, confusion giving way to dawning understanding, and finally something close to desperation. "That is not all I said," he said quickly. "Margaret, that is not even close to all I said." "Then tell me now," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. "All of it, please." Elias crossed the small distance between them, taking her hands in his with an urgency that startled them both. "I told him this marriage began as an act of defiance," he said, "because that is simply true, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I told him it became something else entirely, somewhere between the ledgers we reviewed together and the tenant cottages we visited, and the night you stood beside me at that assembly, and refused to let anyone diminish you. I told him it became the truest thing in my life, the one decision I made in anger that I have never once regretted, not for a single day since." Margaret felt her carefully guarded composure finally give way entirely, tears she had been holding back for weeks now slipping free without permission. "Why did you not simply tell me this yourself?" she asked, instead of a solicitor who had no reason to care. "Because I did not know how," Elias admitted. "My entire life, I have watched honesty punished in this house. My mother's honesty punished with exile. My own honesty punished with cold indifference whenever I dared express it as a boy. I have spent so long believing that saying such things aloud, to the person who matters most, invites exactly the kind of pain my mother suffered, that I did not know how to simply say the words to your face, even though I have wanted to for weeks." "Say them now," Margaret said softly. "Please." Elias's hands tightened gently around hers, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the careful, guarded distance she had grown accustomed to since the wedding day. "I love you," he said. "Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude for everything you have done for this estate and this family, though I am grateful for all of it. I love you because you refused to be intimidated by my father, because you saw the neglect in my own household before I did, and cared enough to fix it, because you make this cold house feel like something worth returning to at the end of every difficult day. Please do not leave. Whatever fear brought you to that trunk, I promise you, it was built on an incomplete truth, and I am asking you now, honestly, without anyone else standing between us, to stay." Margaret searched his face for any trace of the careful performance she had feared, any hint that these words were spoken merely out of guilt at finding the trunk packed, or convenience at avoiding another difficult confrontation so soon after the last one. But she found none of it, only the plain, unguarded honesty of a man who had spent his entire life afraid to offer exactly this. "I need to know it is not guilt speaking," she said quietly, "or fear of being alone again, after everything with your father." "It is neither," Elias said firmly. "I have had 3 weeks now to sit with the quiet in this house and understand precisely what has been missing from it. And it is you, Margaret, only and entirely you. I chose you once in anger, at a village fair, without truly knowing you at all. I am choosing you again now, with complete clarity, knowing exactly who you are, and I will go on choosing you every day after this one, if you will allow me the chance." Margaret felt the last of her doubt finally dissolve, replaced by something warm and certain that had been quietly growing in her for weeks beneath the fear she had allowed to take root instead. She reached up and touched his face gently, and Elias leaned into the touch as though he had been waiting his entire life for exactly this kind of gentleness offered freely, without condition. "There is one more thing," Elias said, "before you decide fully. I do not want you to stay only because I have finally said the right words tonight. I want you to know that I intend to prove it, every day after this one, not merely in moments like this but in the ordinary work of a life shared honestly, in continuing to ask your counsel on the estate, in continuing to visit tenants together, in never again allowing 3 weeks of silence to grow between us without addressing it directly." "I would like that," Margaret said, wiping the last of her tears away with the back of her hand, though a small, unsteady laugh had crept into her voice now. "I confess I am not entirely without fault in this. I should have simply asked you what you meant, that first night, rather than carrying the doubt alone for weeks. Mrs. Dunmore was the one who finally told me as much this afternoon." Elias smiled, the first full, easy smile Margaret had seen from him since the confrontation with his father. "Then I owe Mrs. Dunmore a debt I am not certain I can properly repay," he said. "She will likely remind you of it for years to come," Margaret said, and this time her laugh came freely, unburdened by the weeks of careful distance that had stood between them until only moments earlier. "Then I will stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I choose to." Elias pulled her close, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, simply standing together in the quiet room, the closed trunk forgotten at the foot of the bed, the weight of weeks of unspoken fear finally lifting between them. The following morning, Margaret unpacked the trunk herself, returning each dress carefully to its place, and when Mrs. Dunmore passed her in the hallway and glanced meaningfully at the empty space where the trunk had stood, Margaret simply smiled, a real, unguarded smile that the housekeeper returned with quiet satisfaction. Spring arrived properly within the week, the frost finally melting from the fields entirely, the first green shoots pushing up through the soil along the estate's long drive. Elias kept his promise about the portrait, commissioning a new painting of his mother from an old sketch Margaret had found tucked inside one of the letters they had gathered as evidence, and together they hung it in the space that had stood bare since before Margaret's arrival, a quiet act of restoration that felt, to both of them, like the final closing of an old wound. They stood together before the portrait on a bright morning in early spring, Elias's arm around her shoulders, and Margaret thought of the frightened, uncertain woman who had arrived at Culross Hall months earlier, married to a stranger for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and marveled quietly at how completely that arrangement had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted at the start. Henry arrived for his promised visit that same week, and Margaret watched with quiet pleasure as her brother and her husband, 2 men who had regarded each other with open suspicion at the wedding, spent an entire afternoon walking the estate together, discussing crop rotations and tenant repairs with a growing, genuine ease that surprised them both. That evening, over a dinner far warmer than the one Margaret had first shared with Elias months earlier, Henry raised his glass and offered a toast to his sister's marriage, admitting freely, with a small, teasing smile in Elias's direction, that he had been entirely wrong to doubt the Duke's intentions. "I judged you unfairly," Henry said. "I am glad to have been proven wrong." "You had good reason for your caution," Elias replied. "I am simply glad your sister did not share it, or I might never have had the chance to prove you wrong at all." Later that night, after Henry had retired to the guest rooms and the house had grown quiet again, Margaret and Elias walked together through the garden, the air finally warm enough to linger outdoors without a shawl, the first stars appearing faintly overhead. The old Duke's threat had promised that by spring, they would both regret the marriage entirely. Instead, spring had brought them exactly the opposite. A marriage built first on defiance and necessity, tested by cruelty and fear, and finally, deliberately, chosen freely by two people who had learned, together, what it truly meant to build a life on honesty rather than obligation. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, Margaret understood now, with a certainty she had never expected to feel on that cold day at the village fair, that she would face them exactly as she intended to face everything from this day forward, not alone, and not afraid, but beside the man she had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, come to love. A full year had passed since the night Margaret nearly left Culross Hall, and on a warm morning in early summer, she stood in the garden watching Elias attempt, with far more determination than skill, to teach a young nephew of one of the tenants how to properly fly a kite against the stiff breeze coming off the fields. The boy's laughter carried across the lawn, bright and unrestrained, and Margaret found herself smiling at the sight of her husband, once so careful and guarded, now entirely willing to make a fool of himself for the amusement of a child who was not even his own. The estate had changed considerably in the months since the confrontation with the old Duke. Word of his schemes and their thorough collapse had traveled well beyond the county, and though he remained alive and technically still bearing his title until his death, his influence had withered almost entirely, most of society choosing, quietly and without fanfare, to simply stop inviting him to anything of consequence. He lived now in a smaller property some distance from Culross Hall, attended by a reduced staff, and Elias had made peace, slowly and imperfectly, with the fact that some wounds between father and son might never fully close, though the fear that had once governed every interaction between them had finally, permanently, lost its grip. Margaret had continued managing much of the estate's accounts, a role the tenants and staff had come to trust completely, and under her careful attention, Culross Hall had grown steadily more prosperous, its cottages properly maintained, its fields well managed, its people treated with a fairness that had been entirely absent under the old Duke's long shadow. She had also, in the past year, become something of a quiet advocate for other young women in the county navigating marriages arranged more for convenience than affection, offering practical advice and, when needed, simply a sympathetic ear, remembering well what it had felt like to walk into a marriage as a stranger with no promise of anything beyond survival. Henry visited often now, his position at the solicitor's office having grown into a genuine partnership, and he had recently begun courting a young woman from the county town, a baker's daughter with a sharp wit that reminded Margaret fondly of her own younger self. Their father's health had continued to improve steadily, freed finally from the weight of debts and worry, and he had taken to visiting Culross Hall each month, delighting in long conversations with Elias about scripture and philosophy that stretched late into the evening, an unlikely friendship neither man had expected but both had come to treasure. As for Elias and Margaret themselves, the easy companionship that had first taken root during those early weeks of shared ledgers and tenant visits had only deepened with time, though it had not been without its ordinary difficulties. Disagreements over estate decisions, the occasional misunderstanding that required patient, honest conversation to resolve, the small frictions any two people sharing a life inevitably encountered. But where Margaret had once feared that honesty invited only pain in this house, she had learned instead, alongside Elias, that honesty offered freely, and received with patience, could turn even the coldest house into a true home. There had been one particular disagreement, early in the winter following their reconciliation, when Elias had made a decision about a tenant dispute without consulting her first, reverting briefly to the old habit of carrying burdens alone, rather than sharing them. Margaret had been hurt, though this time she did not retreat into silent packing or quiet withdrawal, remembering the lesson Mrs. Dunmore had given her the previous spring. Instead, she told him plainly, that evening, exactly how his decision had made her feel, shut out of a partnership they had both promised to build honestly. Elias had listened, genuinely listened, and apologized without defensiveness, and by the following morning the two of them had reversed the decision together, involving the tenant fully, in a fairer resolution than either of them could have reached alone. It was a small disagreement in the end, but Margaret remembered it often afterward as proof that they had truly learned to handle conflict differently than the silence and fear that had nearly ended their marriage the year before. Mrs. Dunmore, for her part, had grown into something closer to a trusted friend than a mere housekeeper, and Margaret made a point of including her in small family celebrations whenever propriety allowed, a gesture that the older woman received with visible, though carefully understated, pleasure. She had, after all, served this family through its darkest years, and she deserved to witness, too, the warmth that had finally returned to Culross Hall after so long without it. That afternoon, once the kite had finally been retrieved from a stubborn tree branch and the tenant's nephew sent home with a satisfied grin, Elias found Margaret sitting beneath the old oak tree near the garden's edge, a small stack of letters in her lap, replies she had been drafting to several of the young women she had taken to advising. He sat quietly for a moment, watching her sort through the letters before speaking again. "There is a young woman in the village," he said, "the miller's daughter, who I understand has been asking after your advice regarding a match her family wishes to arrange. I did not realize your reputation for plain speaking had traveled quite so far beyond our own household." Margaret laughed softly, setting the letters aside. "Plain speaking seems to be in short supply among families arranging marriages for convenience," she said. "I only tell them what I wish someone had told me, that a marriage begun without love is not necessarily a marriage doomed to remain that way, provided both people are willing to be honest with each other along the way, and brave enough to ask the questions they are afraid to ask." "That is rather specific advice," Elias said, a teasing note creeping into his voice. "It comes from rather specific experience," Margaret replied, nudging him lightly with her shoulder. "You have made yourself quite indispensable to half the county," he said, settling down beside her on the grass, an informality that would have scandalized his father entirely. "I learned from a very patient teacher," Margaret said, smiling, "though I do not think I have ever properly thanked Mrs. Dunmore for pushing me toward that conversation, all those months ago. I dread to think what might have happened had she simply let me finish packing that trunk in silence." Elias reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the same easy familiarity that had once felt so new between them, and now felt as natural as breathing. "I think about that night often," he admitted. "How close we came to losing everything, simply through silence and fear neither of us knew how to name aloud." "We know better now," Margaret said. "We do," Elias agreed, "though I suspect we will both need reminding of it, now and again, for the rest of our lives." They sat together beneath the oak tree as the afternoon light softened toward evening, watching the fields beyond the garden sway gently in the breeze, fields that had once been neglected under Colton's quiet theft, and were now green and thriving under careful, honest management. Margaret thought of the frightened young woman who had agreed to marry a stranger out of necessity, standing amid the noise of a village fair with no notion of what her life was about to become, and felt a deep, settled gratitude for every difficult step that had led her here, to this quiet garden, this steady hand in hers, this life she had ultimately chosen freely rather than merely accepted out of desperation. That evening, as they walked back toward the house together, Elias paused near the space in the hallway where his mother's portrait now hung, its colors bright and warm against the old stone wall, restoring some small measure of the presence that had been stolen from this house so many years earlier. "I used to walk past this spot every day as a boy," he said, "and feel nothing but absence. Now I feel as though she is finally, properly, part of this house again." "She would have liked you very much, as you are now," Margaret said softly. "I am certain of it." Elias looked at the portrait a moment longer, then turned to Margaret with an expression of quiet, complete contentment that had become familiar over the past year, though it never failed to warm something deep within her chest each time she saw it. "Come," he said, extending his hand. "Henry will think we have abandoned him to dine alone if we linger out here much longer." Margaret laughed and took his hand, and together they walked back into the warmly lit house, leaving the portrait watching over the hallway behind them, a quiet reminder of everything that had been lost, and everything, against every early expectation, that had ultimately been found. Inside, Henry was already seated at the table, teasing the younger footman about a card game the two of them had apparently been playing before dinner, and the room filled quickly with the easy, comfortable noise of a household that had, in the space of a single year, transformed from a place of cold silence into one of genuine warmth. Margaret took her seat beside Elias, watching her brother laugh freely in a house that had once made her tremble to enter, and felt, more strongly than ever, the quiet certainty that every difficult step of the past year had led exactly where it was meant to. After dinner, once Henry had retired and the house had settled into its familiar late-evening quiet, Elias and Margaret climbed the stairs together, pausing once more before the portrait in the hallway, its painted eyes warm and watchful in the low candlelight. "Good night, Mother," Elias said softly, a habit he had quietly begun in recent months, one Margaret had never commented on, understanding instinctively that it needed no explanation. They continued on to their rooms together, and Margaret thought, as she had many times over the past year, that the old Duke's bitter prophecy had been answered in the only way that truly mattered, not with regret, but with a marriage that had grown, season by season, into precisely the kind of quiet, steady love neither of them had believed possible on the cold afternoon they first stood together in a small stone church, strangers bound by necessity, who had since become, through patience and honesty and the courage to finally speak what they feared most, exactly what they had once only pretended to be. The old Duke's bitter promise, that spring would bring only regret, had been answered instead with exactly its opposite, a marriage built first on defiance, tested by cruelty, and finally, deliberately, chosen and rechosen with each passing season, by two people who had learned, together, that the truest kind of love was not the sudden reckless spark that had brought them together at a village fair, but the patient, ordinary work of choosing each other, honestly and completely, every single day that followed.